Good evening. I'm Catherine Bealey from the League of Women Voters. I can say that. We and the American Association of University Women are hosting this webinar in advance of a challenging, if pivotal, legislative session. Our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes each, after which we will take a few directed questions. There will be time for more general questions at the close of the session. Please add your questions and comments in the Q&A section on the screen. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists, beginning with Eric Biggart, Executive Director of Utah Votes. He will be followed by Gina Cornia, Executive Director of Utahns Against Hunger. Then we'll hear from David Reymann of Parr, Brown, Guillen, Loveless, and one of our attorneys in the Proposition 4 case. Finally, we'll wrap up with Lexie Tuddenham, Executive Director of HEAL Utah. So now, without further ado, let's start with Eric, Utah Votes. How are you, Eric?
I'm great. It's somehow Thursday evening. It's wonderful to be with you all. It's a privilege to get to speak with you all this evening. I was just telling my fellow panelists how insecure I feel talking about voting rights to this very esteemed group of people. So I'm going to try and keep my remarks as short as possible. And I wanted to start out first with the introduction of like who I am in Utah Votes, and then kind of a story about voting real quick. So my name's Eric. I am the executive director of Utah Votes, which is a coalition of nonprofits, specifically 501c4 nonprofits that work in the space of elections and lobbying and doing our best to try and influence a more representative Utah. Our nonprofit organizations are my priority in the day-to-day, so I'm happy to help them accomplish their goals. And this week, their goals has been all about recruiting. So if anybody from any of those organizations is on the call, I just want to thank everybody for everyone's efforts this week in recruiting wonderful candidates to run in Utah and to keep the state competitive. It's been like a remarkable and a humbling day, and I'm happy to chat with anybody on the side about why I think that, but it's going to be a very interesting 2026, I'll say that. 2026 is happening at a very unique moment in history, I think, for voting rights, for democracy in particular. I think that is because the 2024 election was the first time, at least in my lifetime, that the data after the election told us that more people voting had the opposite effect that all of us thought it was going to. It has been the political opinion of experts for years that the more people who vote, the more people who would vote for a Democratic candidate. Turns out that flipped for the first time in history. And when I look at Utah and the Utah legislature and the session that's coming up, it occurs to me that I think they finally just realized that, because I am not seeing the same appetite for attacking the right to vote that we've seen in the past, because I like to think that it's just dawned on people that voting actually benefits more than what we thought it benefited in the past. But I want to share a story real quick. I have a weird habit in my position where I go to the Lieutenant Governor's website on the current voter registration statistics page, and I try and take a screenshot. I forget to do it most of the time, to see how many active and inactive voters there are in the state. And that shows you by party how many active and inactive voters there are. I took a screenshot, I don't remember why, on December 8th, which works out great because that was a month ago. And my screenshot on December 8th showed an interesting number, and it kind of made sense to me. I went back today, actually it was yesterday that I screenshotted this, to see how things had changed in 1 month over a holiday. And I was absolutely perplexed by something, because there are 17,000 more voters today than there were a month ago. And I thought, why is that? And then if you look at the numbers, who those voters are, it's not so much about active and inactive. So it's not that people didn't vote and they're just being dropped off the rolls. There is 1,000 less Democratic voters. There's 6,000 more Republican voters, and the unaffiliated number went up about 8,000 people. And I had no idea why this was. It was driving me crazy for the last couple of days. Then I had a call this morning with one of my colleagues from Better Boundaries, and we were talking about signature gathering efforts to repeal Proposition 4 and who the people are that are signing the petitions and trying to figure out where those signatures are coming from and all of that. And then it occurred to me, that's why there's 17,000 more voters today, because signature gatherers are probably registering people to vote. And I used to work at an organization in DC. It was called Civic Nation. It was part of Michelle Obama's voting effort. It was a group called When We All Vote. And they did a ton of work to register people to vote ahead of the 2022 and 2024 elections. And we would always like hear them, oh, we went and did this event at an HBCU in Mississippi, and we had 40 volunteers show up. And I'd say, well, how many people do you register to vote? And they'd say like 150. And I'd say, well, okay, that seems like a decent effort. So when I see 17,000 people in 1 month because of signature gathering efforts, I'm a little concerned because that's just so far out of the norm. Not that I want less people to be voting, I want everybody to be voting, but that seems like a dramatic spike. So all of that is to say, first of all, before I get into any of the specifics, make sure you're registered to vote and make sure everyone in your household is registered to vote. And more importantly, if you know anyone who's moved, make sure they're registered to vote. I was talking to a gentleman today who shared with me a statistic that, and I verified it with my friends at the Voter Participation Center, that 52% of people under the age of 35 have moved in the last 4 years. And 53% of African Americans under 35 have moved in the last 4 years. Movers and people who are just turning 18 are a tremendous opportunity of new voter registrations. So if you know anyone who's moved recently, maybe just nudge them and say, hey, have you registered to vote? I went to an event not too long ago. There was just a social event, and I thought, I'm going to do a social experiment. And I got a sign with the QR code to vote.utah.gov, and I walked around holding it, and I talked to every single person at the event, and I said, are you registered to vote? And they said, yes. And then I said, at your current address? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And there was 109 people that came to that event that checked in. I got 27 people to realize that they were not registered to vote at their current address. So that's my spiel on that. Utah is actually a bit of an anomaly. We are one of the few states that had a increase in vote share in 2024 over 2020. And we have this huge discrepancy between what they call underrepresented voters and non-underrepresented voter or non-underrepresented communities. So what that essentially boils down to is the white population in Utah increased their voting percentage in 2024 by 18.5%. The underrepresented communities increased their vote percentage by 5%. So there is work to do for all of us in registering more people to vote who have not voted previously. So when I go look to the legislative session this year, which I've been tracking some bill files as they've been open and thinking like what terrible things are going to happen, I'm actually a little bit surprised because most of the scary things don't really fall into this purview from what I can tell. I went through all of these open bill files to see like what was the stuff that kind of had to do with voting. And most of the stuff is scary things to happen with signature gathering, which I am more than happy to let David explain why those things are going to be scary later. There's perhaps my least favorite bill that I've seen in a long time, which looks like it would allow for more political yard signs to be placed in public places, which is the bane of my existence. There's a House Joint Resolution this year that would enact term limits on legislators, which I'm over the moon about. We'll see where that goes. There's a relatively scary joint resolution about the governor's ability to appoint people to the court without a commission recommendation that I think we should all be monitoring. There is another somewhat concerning bill that would make Election Day a state holiday, which I guess sounds nice on its face. But when I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, she said, no, we don't want that because that's how they get rid of mail in voting. So the 3D chess here is always interesting, and that one got me. Um, my other favorite thing, which we'll see if it goes anywhere, is HB 92, which would move Utah from being a winner take all state in the electoral college to being a proportional representative state. That to me would be huge. We'll see what happens there. But besides that, um, nothing jumped out at me terribly. Let me just leave you with one last thought about the legislative session. Um, and that is, as I've been tracking filings this week as people declare to run for office in November, I cannot remember a time in history where this many legislators of both parties have been retiring. There are going to be more lame ducks, people who are quitting right after the legislative session, and people not running than any time I can remember in history. And on top of that, there are more legislators receiving intra-party primaries than any time I can remember in my time in Utah politics. So I went into this legislative session relatively afraid. I feel like I can only get so afraid from year to year. And every year they say this is going to be a bad year. But I feel the sense of hope today because the combination of lame ducks and primary accountability means we might see some interesting stuff happen. There might be some people who decide to break with leadership. There might be some people who go rogue. For goodness sakes, we have a term limits bill from a Republican legislator already. So I think it's going to be an interesting session. Pay close attention. And I will leave you with one final plug to stay involved as much as you can through the League of Women Voters. And if you aren't subscribed to my wonderful friend Chase's Better Utah Beehive briefing that will come out every day during the legislative session, there's as much good information in there as you'll ever find. So you can check that out at Better Utah's website. And with that, I appreciate you all for having me, and I'll throw it back to Kathy.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. We actually think you should join the league. You're pretty good at registering voters, which is exactly what we do. We welcome
27.
men.
That's my record.
Yeah, we welcome men as well as women. We do have one question for you. Did the voter registration votes give you data about the counties that those 17,000 new voters came from?
That's a good question. The lieutenant governor's website doesn't have that. I could dive in deeper. I am waiting to get an updated voter file, and I can maybe pull those numbers in the future. But my hunch is that it's corresponding to where those signature gatherers are being successful, which has been not northern Utah, Salt Lake, Utah counties. Uh, that's my hunch, at least.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that you said there weren't very many scary bills. I'm thinking a lot of the scary legislation has already happened, and you mentioned mailed ballots. That is one thing that's coming at us, and we all need to be concerned that there's going to be more coming. Okay. Thank you so much, Eric. We will move on now to Gina Cornia. Hi, Gina.
Hello, Kathy. How are you tonight?
Good.
Good.
Can't wait to hear from you.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I have nothing fun to like. It's all bad. Um, I have been doing this for a long time. My first policy job was working at Utah Issues in 1996, about 2 weeks after welfare reform was passed and signed by President Clinton. And that was bad. I mean, that really was the beginning, of dismantling of the safety net. And 2025 was just as damaging and perhaps more so than welfare reform. And it, really started in January of 2020. Well, we saw it coming too. I mean, Project 2025. I mean, it lays out what, especially very conservative groups would like to see with the social safety net. And so we were anticipating, things to get ugly really quickly, and they did. Um, During the whole Doge sweep, Utah lost about $10 million in either grants or food product from the USDA. And the biggest pieces were two pretty large local purchasing agreements. One was through the Utah State Board of Education, which contracted with marginalized producers to buy local food for elementary schools and or for school meals and for child care centers. The other one, which is through the Department of Health and Human Services, was another grant that also focused on marginalized producers. So women farmers, LGBT, veterans, disabled. So if you were in this marginalized group, you could qualify for this funding. So the Department of Health and Human Services, along with a consortium of pantries and producers, got funding that would allow them to have fresher local produce and meat in in food pantries. Those were also eliminated. So not only did that impact those pantries not having access to that product anymore, but it also impacted these small producers who already had contracts in place. And so we knew like then it was just going to start getting uglier. And as we went into the HR 1, the House Resolution 1, the reconciliation bill, and saw very quickly that SNAP, in particular, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, was going to be a huge, huge target. And so, what we were left with at the end, and what I will talk about what we need to do going into the session, was a fundamental change in the commitment that the federal government has to federal nutrition programs, specifically SNAP. That there has always been a really strong partnership between the feds and states, and the feds giving states a lot of flexibility in operating that program and administering it in a way that made sense for them. So they really pulled back on a lot of those options. So states that have more progressive programs and use more progressive policies that allow more people to be eligible, lots of those folks are not going to be eligible anymore. They also expanded the work requirements. What a lot of people don't know is that the SNAP program has always had work requirements. And for able-bodied adults without dependents, that used to mean a household with a child 18 or younger were exempt from work. Now they've dropped that age to 14, and they've raised the top age from 55 to 64. So if you are in a household with a child 14 or older up to the age of 64, you will now be required to work. And what we know is that about 82% of those folks who are able to work do work. But what this does is captures a more vulnerable group of people at the top end of that age range that will have a difficult time finding employment. And that went into effect on November 1st. So, and we all remember what was happening in November, which was the government shutdown. So, that along with eliminating eligibility for refugees from the SNAP program. So, about 3,000 refugees will lose SNAP benefits as they come up for recertification. Um, a lot of the immigrants who have been eligible will no longer be eligible, including folks who have visas for human trafficking, for domestic violence. They've also eliminated exemptions for folks who are homeless, folks who are aging out of foster care, and veterans. So it's all about to get a lot worse for low income people who are going to try and afford, continue to afford groceries. Um, Added to that is they've done a cost shift. So the federal government used to pay 50% of administration, and the state used to pay 50%. They've now shifted that to 25, 75, and going into this next legislative session, we have to get $13 million from appropriations in order to maintain the SNAP program at the current level. So that's going to be an uphill battle. I think one of maybe the positive things, the sort of like the complete freak out and meltdown that we were all having in November when we thought that SNAP benefits weren't going to be issued, was a wake up call for some legislators understanding the depth and the breadth of that program and why it is so important. So that will be our primary goal going into the session, is securing that $13 million. The other one, and this is a bill that we found out just about last week, and that is House Bill 88, Public Assistance Amendments, and it is being run by Representative Trevor Lee. And what it does is essentially make ineligible anybody who is here undocumented if they are going, well, it will require anybody applying for public assistance benefit, or what is considered a federal benefit. So WIC, we think it also will include the supplemental CSF piece, Commodity Supplemental Food Program, which are senior meal boxes. We think that it will also include school meals and, well, for sure, WIC, SNAP, people aren't, and folks who are here undocumented are already not eligible. But so if they get public money, and unless it is for short-term non-cash emergency assistance, they will be prevented from getting those benefits, including immunizations. There's a whole public health section that I can't even think about or even look at. But what we know now is this bill was passed in Idaho last year, and Idaho is being sued by the ACLU of Idaho, um, a physicians group, and then someone else, but they're suing from the public health perspective. And obviously, our concern is the food access piece. They will literally be denying food to infants, like formula, and then an unfunded mandate in requiring a food pantry to verify someone's immigration status to get stale bread. I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling. We still don't know. I know that there's a story that is supposed to be coming out sometime this week with Representative Lee, and my understanding is he has no idea the depth and the breadth of this. But I also know he doesn't care. His goal is to withhold any sort of life-saving, I mean, if there's access to food, if there's access to healthcare, housing, all of that, he wants people cut off because he thinks that that will somehow motivate them to leave, even though, like, with Anyway, so it's going to be bad. Um, Next Tuesday night, Utahns Against Hunger is having an event at the public library, a conversation about food insecurity in Utah. And we will be serving pizza. So I can post the link to register for that. We just have to get people to register for the library, and we'd love to see you there.
Well, $13 million dollars is a lot of money.
I know it is.
Do you have any, I don't know, hope that you can change the minds of legislators? I've seen comments on, Facebook and Instagram and whatever that they think people deserve to be poor.
I,
That, they
you
need to
know,
just pull themselves up.
I don't know, 13 million is a lot. And I mean, I think that there's obviously the case needs to be made, but I think the other thing in addition to just sort of like appealing to people's decency, um, is the fiscal impact. Is if we walk away, if we say, yeah, we don't have 13 million, then we're walking away from 400 million. And that return on investment, and that for every dollar of SNAP spent, that generates $1.74 in economic activity. So not only do we need to make the decency case, but we also have to make the fiscal case that, especially in, a lot of rural communities, the SNAP could easily be 25, or more percent of their profits. And, I know in a lot of states, that's one of the things they're really concerned about are grocery store closing in rural communities because they just don't have the customer base anymore.
So how ironic is it that Utah likes to pride itself on welcoming immigrants and refugees, and now we're basically targeting those very communities?
Yeah, I
So,
know. Yeah, it is. It's very disconcerting. And the other thing is, though, there are efforts underway on the national level. We're talking to our federal delegation about undoing a lot of this. I think it's the realization of the impact of this is starting to dawn on people. I mean, there was, HR1 passed in such a fury and fervor that they weren't paying attention. And I think now, states are like, okay, Congress, how are you going to fix this?
so food pantries, are they able to pick up the slack?
Oh my goodness, no. For every meal that is provided by a pantry, food stamps SNAP provides nine. And we really saw how at the end of October and the beginning of November last year, during the government shutdown, just sort of the response to those SNAP benefits being withheld. And I think that the community sort of got a taste of what it might look like if, those benefits go away. But for those households who have lost access now, legal permanent residents, and refugees who we welcomed to our country. I think one of the things that we have to do is make sure our legislators understand that charity cannot fill the gap. And in fact, you know, as amazing and as comprehensive as the LDS church welfare system is, they can't duplicate it, and they can't, it's just not sustainable over time. I think that these short bursts of emergency assistance, or like everybody sort of scrambling to meet an event, I mean, that can happen. But helping, you know, 200,000 households on a consistent basis over time. There are people, seniors, people with disabilities, and kids are the primary recipients of those benefits. And, it's an expensive program. The benefits are modest. And yeah, we really hope that our legislators step up. I mean, they have to. Like, what are we going to do if we don't have this program?
Yeah. So, one more question. We can add other questions at the end of this whole thing. But Carrie Doan says, if I understand correctly, the 13 million in additional money required to pay the extra administration for SNAP. If that's true, um, that money is not provided, will Utah have to restrict benefits even more?
I think that the short answer is maybe. We don't know. The USDA has given states no guidance on what happens if a state does not fund those additional administrative funds. I mean, theoretically, like I'm Atlanta. Georgia needs like 55 million, I think, for their admin share. And so, nobody knows what will happen. We don't know if they'll be able to change who's eligible, change the benefit amount. We don't know yet. Our biggest fear, obviously, is that states will just walk away.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for this uplifting.
I know, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Thanks very much, Gina. We'll come back to you. David, we're up to you now. David Reymann.
Thanks, Kathy. As Kathy mentioned, I'm one of the lawyers representing the plaintiffs in the redistricting case, and including the league. So it's especially nice to be with you here tonight. I'll start just by saying I know this is a legislative preview, but it's a little bit related. So I'll say a few words about where we are in the lawsuit, and I'm not going to get into the weeds, but happy to answer anybody's questions in the Q&A. There's a lot of moving parts in the case, but just at a very high level, as many of you know, this past summer we won really the third of a historic victory in the case when the district court reinstated Prop 4, said that the legislature's repeal of the initiative was unconstitutional, and invalidated the 2021 gerrymandered congressional map that we had been voting under for the past two election cycles. And that led to essentially a trial in October because she said, she gave the judge gave the legislature another chance and said, it's your job to do this. Go back and comply with Prop 4. And they passed another partisan gerrymandered map that did not comply with Prop 4. And so in November, she issued a decision imposing a remedial map that had been proposed by the plaintiffs that finally, after decades, gave Utah a representative district for Salt Lake County. And that has been it's been something that has not existed in Utah, at least judicially, for quite a while. It has caused the whole time has caused a series of reactions by the legislature refusing to comply with the court's orders. The most recent one was to call a special session in this past fall to push out the deadlines for the congressional election to March. And we don't know exactly what that is going to mean. They said it was so that it could give them time to appeal. We're skeptical of that because they had plenty of chances to appeal before and they blew past all of those deadlines. Just finally yesterday, for the very first time, they filed a notice of appeal on just one part of the case, which we think is procedurally improper. And so that issue is going to be decided in the Utah Supreme Court. We don't know the schedule for that yet, but it's not the whole case. The case is still pending in the district court, and there's still a number of claims down there regarding redistricting that have not been resolved. And so it's kind of to be continued as far as that goes. We don't know whether there's going to be any redistricting legislation that is passed in this next session. We haven't seen anything specific yet, and I don't want to speculate about that. But the legislature has had plenty of opportunities to actually get to actually challenge what the district court did in a higher court, and they haven't taken that chance until yesterday. And as far as the substantive merits of their appeal, we think the Utah Supreme Court spoke pretty clearly the first time this went up there. It's been up there 3 times now. And we don't think there's much chance at all that they are going to say that the district court erred when it found that the legislature's repeal of Prop 4 was unconstitutional. So that's kind of where we stand there. As far as what's coming up in the legislative session, I wanted to just mention a few things, and then happy to answer more questions in particular about any of them. But I'll start with 3 bills that I think will affect, well, 2 bills at least that continue kind of the legislature's ongoing assault against the judiciary because they don't like what the judiciary is doing. They are not used to being told that they can't do whatever they want, and the courts are doing their job and upholding what the Constitution says. And so we think that this session is going to continue their pattern of trying to gut the power of the judiciary. We saw, I believe, also in the special session, a bill that stripped the Supreme Court's ability to pick their own chief justice. There's nothing, necessarily constitutionally wrong with that, but it was sort of just a spit in the eye of the court type of thing. That gets coupled with what I don't know if the bill is out yet, but the first one I'll mention is the court packing bill. It's not a secret that it's coming. It's been in the budget, and we've known about it for months, that they have included in the budget funding for 2 new Supreme Court justices. And the Constitution says that it allows them to expand the court if they want. The Constitution says that there has to be at least 5. The legislature can increase it if they want. And so, but everybody knows what is really, and their ostensible argument is, well, the court is too slow. The court hasn't issued enough opinions. All of that is a lie. It's not supported by the actual data. There's no backlog at the Utah Supreme Court. The backlog is in the lower courts, which have been chronically underfunded by the legislature and in the Court of Appeals. And so if they want to spend money somewhere, that's where they should be spending it for resources. The other reason it's a lie is that anybody who's been in a group trying to come to consensus knows that it's a lot easier to get consensus with 5 people than it is to get 7. Adding 2 more people to a group is not going to speed things up by any means. It's not like you have one person taking a case and another person taking a case. So, that argument is just a superficial canard, and it's really just an excuse to allow this legislature to pack the court with people that they think are friendly to them and will not do what this upstart court has done. And they want to take the justices that they don't like and put them into a minority, particularly the 3 female justices on the court. So you combine that with the fact that the governor now has the chance to appoint the chief justice. And you have essentially a multi-pronged operation by the legislature to try and remake the court for political reasons, which is anathema to the way separation of powers is supposed to work. That's the first bill. The second one is one that Eric alluded to, and that is it's HJR 5. It's a constitutional amendment. So it's in our Constitution that says when there's a judicial vacancy, judicial nominating commissions submit names to the governor picks from them, and the Senate advises and consents. This constitutional amendment would change the Constitution to say that the governor can just pick whoever he wants. He can ask for a nominating commission, but he doesn't need to. He can just pick whoever he wants and appoint them to the judiciary. This comes after a couple years ago, already a bill that gutted the neutrality of judicial nominating commissions to make them, they used to have to be politically balanced. There was a representative of the bar. They didn't like the nominees that were coming up because they thought they were too liberal or too qualified. And so they changed that. And apparently that's not good enough. So they want to change the Constitution to just allow the governor to bypass that entirely and just nominate whoever he wants. So all of that is in service of putting people into the judiciary who won't question what the legislature or the executive does, which is not good either. Um, the other thing I'll mention, just in terms of voting rights and related to the redistricting cases, we fully expect that there may be another proposed amendment that resembles Amendment D that was struck down by the Utah Supreme Court as misleading. We think they're going to try that again. And the upshot of that, for those of you who may not remember, is it is essentially an attempt to overrule what the Supreme Court did in the first appeal in this case and give the legislature the unfettered power to simply repeal any initiative that the people pass. So you know how hard it is to pass initiatives here. You go through all that work, you gather signatures. A lot of you know all of that. You pass the initiative, and then the legislature can turn around and repeal it for any reason at all, no matter what fundamental rights it implicates. It failed to get on the ballot last time because the legislature screwed up the way in which they were presenting it to the people, but we expect they may try that again. That's going to be added to an initiative that is already on the ballot, I believe a constitutional amendment, proposed constitutional amendment that's already on the ballot that requires for initiatives that implicate taxes, essentially, a 60% vote threshold, which is essentially at the ballot box, which is essentially an insurmountable threshold in this state. And the problem is it basically says anytime you pass an initiative that would require money, you have to get 60%. The problem is most initiatives don't dictate how they might be funded. They don't know how it's going to shift tax revenue around or anything like that. So it's essentially an attempt to just get rid of initiatives in Utah. And let me just pause to say one thing about the messaging that's been coming out of the legislature that initiatives are too easy here and they're trying to make us into California. There have been 7 initiatives that have passed since Utah became a state in the late 1800s. It is incredibly hard to get an initiative passed here. It is not like California where it is very, very easy to get things on the ballot. And so that all is misdirection. Our initiative process is reserved for very important things that the people feel strongly about, like Prop 4. And this is an attempt to get rid of that. There's also another constitutional amendment that changes publication requirements for constitutional amendments that I don't think is all that important, so I'll just mention it. And then just 3 last things that I just want to mention, and I won't dwell on them, but I just want to flag them for people. The first one that may be most important for this group is these are all a trilogy of Trevor Lee specials, by the way. The guy, apparently has an unending supply of brilliant ideas. All 3 of these are his bills. The first one is HB 175. It is sort of kind of innocuously titled Political Funds and Political Activities Amendments. But the upshot of it, it's a little complicated, but the upshot of it is if you're an organization that receives any state funds, any state grants, you are now prohibited from engaging in any political activity. You can't contribute to any campaign. You can't contribute anything of value, which may mean even volunteer time. And that I know there are a lot of organizations in the state that receive certain types of state funds. And the way I read it at least, is sort of straight out of the Trump playbook that says if you're receiving federal funds, we can do whatever we want to you and coerce you into being quiet or supporting our causes. And it's an attempt to silence, organizational support for causes that the legislature doesn't like. Second one is, and I haven't read this bill, so I'll just be very high level, but what I've heard is it is a comprehensive anti-trans bill that essentially would erase the ability to identify as transgender in Utah. The code would be changed to change all references to gender back to sex. You would be unable to change any of your identifying documents to reflect your gender identity. And most concerning of all, it would strip transgender identity or gender identity period out of the Utah Compromise, which means that you could discriminate at will in housing and employment against people for being transgender. Um, and the third one, and this is maybe the most absurd, but it's also offensive, is a bill that would give the legislature the power to rename certain designated streets and highways in Utah. And it specifically gives the legislature the power to rename 9th South, which is Harvey Milk Boulevard right now, to Charlie Kirk Boulevard, which I'm sure the irony is lost on no one. Of not only, I mean, it's not like there aren't other streets. You could name Charlie Kirk Boulevard if you really wanted to, but taking away the name of an LGBT icon and replacing it with someone who was anti-gay marriage and virulently anti-transgender is it's more than a message bill. It's really just kind of another attempt to sort of erase the identity of a number of Utahns. So I don't, know that I share Eric's hope this time of the year. It's kind of my least favorite 45 days of the year, but those are the at least the bills that I was able to see coming up.
Thank you, David. We have had one question asking who sponsored 175. And Millie, what David said is these are a trilogy of Representative Trevor Lee. He's the representative who's putting all of these wonderful bills out there.
Yeah.
So one question I have, David, is how would you define political? I mean, let's talk about Better Days 2020. That is a pretty, I don't know, easy group. They just talk about women in politics, but it is political. So would they lose their funding? I think they got $2 million the first time around.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the bill, and I haven't had a ton of time to peruse it, but it looks like it defines political purpose as an act very broadly, an act done with the intent or in a way to influence or tend to influence directly or indirectly any individual to refrain from voting or to vote for or against an individual seeking public office or a ballot proposition. So it's candidates or things that are on the ballot. It's hard to think of what that doesn't cover.
Hmm, interesting. So one other thing, how do we combat misinformation? Because it's rampant, particularly during the signature gathering phase. Um, what do we do to combat it?
It's difficult. I mean, it's a problem that's playing out all over the country, and the transformation of traditional media into social media has made it much more difficult. And not just because it's so much easier to get misinformation if you're getting just your news from social media, but also because it's caused people to question everything and just say, well, I'm in an epistemic state of not knowing anything. I have to be agnostic about truth. There is no more truth. There are just alternative facts, and that's been going on for a while now. And I think, I don't know the answer to that. I think that it is really important for people to have one-on-one conversations with their friends and neighbors. If you are educated and have read up on things and have heard things from credible sources, and to say that's actually not true. I heard stories about people who, when these signature gatherers for I should have mentioned, there's also a referendum going on right now to repeal Prop 4, and they're trying to gather signatures, and hopefully they don't get there. There's a mid-February deadline to try and get signatures, but you probably all have heard, or some of you have heard about the misleading statements that have been made by paid signature gatherers to try and get people to sign the petition. Things like, oh, this is to support what Judge Gibson did. This is to support the map that she instituted, which is obviously not true. And there are people that would go up to, people who are being tricked, essentially, and say that's not true. And so that's an inefficient way, but it at least is a better way than just one more post on TikTok or social media that says this isn't true, because that just adds to the, cacophony online. And so I don't have a great answer for you. I think that it is the ecosystem that we're living in, and I think it's important for all of us to try and educate ourselves because everyone here is probably relatively politically active and on the much higher end of the spectrum and sort of higher information voters than most people. Most people are not higher information voters and they don't tune in to elections until very close to the election. And so I think it's important to have those conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, to try and get the actual facts out, because there are still actual facts, that matter. And it's just a matter of trying to get a critical mass of people who understand that.
Thank you, David. I mean, we know our co-plaintiffs, the Mormon Women for Ethical Government, put up something from the White House today. So there is a lot of misinformation coming from the White House as well. Okay, thank you, David. We'll come back to you in a bit. And Lexie, we are on to you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. So grateful for everything that the League of Women Voters does, as well as what the other folks on this call are also doing. Here at Heal Utah, we feel very strongly that a healthy democracy is absolutely fundamental to having a healthier environment and a healthier future for all Utahns, regardless of their background, regardless of where they live, and regardless of where they work. So I'm going to share my screen and see if it works. If not, I'll just carry on without it. But here goes. Let's see.
Oh.
Can you see that? Great. Okay. So just a quick background. I'm the executive director at the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah. We've been around for about 26 years. For those of you who don't know us, we have been focused on creating a better and healthier future for all Utahns since our founding out in Tooele County, where we were formed by a group of citizens who were really concerned about the multiple health exposures that they were seeing in their community and the impacts around reproductive and health cancers and a lot of childhood cancers in a community that was being impacted by weapons testing, by nerve gas incineration, and many other exposures, including those from US magnesium. So let's see if I can figure out how to click here. So we've been around for about 26 years. We have 25,000 plus members across the state. We work on three primary areas, which are to advance clean air, clean energy, and comprehensive solutions to radioactive and toxic exposures. We have a number of priorities through the legislative session that we will be tracking. We have a bill tracker, and we also hold community lobbying sessions every single Tuesday up at the Capitol. We invite you to join us, whether you're up there as a League of Women voter representative or just a everyday community member. We can train you up, we can connect you to your legislators, and we really truly think that it is incredibly important that your legislators hear from you, because otherwise they're going to come up with these top-down solutions to things like air quality challenges that don't actually represent the conditions on the ground where folks are living and being impacted by these decisions. I'm going to do a quick run through our first two areas, air quality and energy, and spend a little bit more time on radioactive and toxic exposures because I anticipate that might be where I might get more questions. A few things that we know are going to be coming down the line this legislative session are things around mining regulations. So specifically, there's been a lot of legislation around gravel pits and aggregate operations over the last couple of years. Many of you might have heard about the Parley's Canyon proposed gravel pit. And there was legislation last year that we were able to slightly clean up so that it was not quite as bad, that potentially expedited the ability of such operations to expand from small to large while circumventing air quality regulations. There's actually a public comment period currently open through the Division of Air Quality on the Parley's Canyon air permit. If you want to learn more about that, we're happy to share information, but we do anticipate that there will be some more regulation around aggregate mining because our legislators are really focused on creating more sources of gravel, for producing concrete, for fueling our building and our growth. We also know at both the federal and the state level, permitting reform has become quite the buzzword. We think that there is room for permitting reform, but what we are truly concerned about is the ways that we are seeing it be enacted. And we want to ensure that as we perhaps move permitting for all sorts of operations and industries along, that we are not cutting out opportunities for meaningful public comment, and that we're not skirting around true and meaningful environmental review that actually looks at the impacts on the ground of what some of these operations might do. We also saw some attempts last legislative session to shift regulatory power. In one instance specifically, we saw the legislature make a move to take independent power away from the Division of Air Quality and put it back in themselves. We probably will see more movement like that as we are seeing that same sort of consolidation happen at the federal level. And finally, on a more hopeful note, there is a really exciting effort going on at the state level under the rubric of the Beehive Emissions Reduction Plan, which is really our best bet right now within the state to comprehensively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's sort of slated as being about air quality, but it also will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully help out with climate change. There's a lot of work that is being done there, and there are opportunities for engagement. But in particular, we might see some work around public and active transit there. On energy, as I think a couple people mentioned, there's probably going to be a lot of legislation on this because there's a real focus on it from the federal level on down. We certainly see this big, beautiful coal movement come back into full force. I guess we're a little bit ahead of the curve on that, and our legislature has already attempted to continue to force coal plants to operate within the state, even when the operating utility really didn't want to do that. So what we're trying to promote and focus on at the state level is energy resilience and energy affordability. So what that means is that we want to make sure that as we see increased demand for electricity, particularly from these large load customers like data centers, we're making sure that those do not negatively impact ratepayers. And that does not end up creating huge issues around water scarcity for communities that are hosting them. We have already seen a bill specifically looking at water use from data centers, and we anticipate that we will probably see more as well. Unfortunately, there's also been an attack at the federal and state level on solar energy. We've increasingly moved to defund and make it harder to do solar and wind energy projects in state. And we've already seen a bill that's very likely to pass from Representative Jack move forward there. A lot of the rhetoric around those is quite, I think, unfortunate. We hear a lot about how people don't like the look of solar panels, whereas they seem to be completely okay with coal plants. However, what we are hoping to see happen is that the solar industry, which has a very strong voice and has an opportunity to provide a lot of really good jobs, as well as tax base in this state, will be able to hold the line on some of that work. And we also know that there are some good bills coming up around fair wages for folks who work in industries associated around the energy industry and specifically things like the electrical workers union. We're also hoping to see some really good legislation on geothermal energy. Geothermal is a really promising source of energy in state that we think has a lot of potential to help not only repurpose some of the technology from the fracking industry, but also provide a lot of good jobs and eventually some really strong and resilient and powerful energy sources to fuel our growth. So moving on there, I'm going to talk a little bit more about nuclear power. I know there are a lot of things to pay attention to in the state, but one of the really big ones that has come up in the last year or so is around Utah's focus on nuclear energy. So we have seen Utah in the last legislative session pass bills to really set the groundwork for an expansion of nuclear energy and development, as well as for expanding every single part of the nuclear fuel chain. So that includes expanded opportunities for uranium mining and milling, expanded opportunities for waste disposal, expanded opportunities for nuclear manufacturing, and potentially fuel manufacturing even in state. If you follow HEAL at all, you might have heard about a recent proposal that was approved in December, right before Christmas. So essentially, the Northwest Interstate Compact is an entity that manages radioactive waste in our section of the country. And they recently approved a request, unfortunately, to import 1.3 million tons of nuclear waste from Canada for permanent disposal at the Energy Solutions facility in the West Desert. So Energy Solutions actually set the groundwork for that during the last legislative session. They basically told the legislature that if they were able to expand their disposal cells in an expedited fashion, then they would give the state about $30 million towards its nuclear slush fund for more nuclear energy development. And I think when you look at those numbers, you can only imagine how much that particular company is going to profit from that while putting the lives of Utahns and many other people along that transport route at risk. We expect to see more in that area this year. There's also been an interesting and very concerning interest in reopening nuclear testing at the Nevada test site that we've heard from the Trump administration. This was actually included in Project 2025. Early on last year, it seemed that perhaps calmer heads were going to prevail, but we've heard our president express interest in reopening testing. So we are hoping to see really strong pushback from a bipartisan coalition to talk about how we do not want more nuclear testing at the Nevada test site or anywhere in the US, because indeed we are the primary downwind state. We were just able, unfortunately, in the one good thing that I can think of that came out of that so-called Big Beautiful Bill was an expansion of the Radioactive Exposure Compensation Act, which finally, after decades of denying this, allowed people on the Wasatch Front and in other counties of Utah to apply for compensation through the Radioactive Exposure Compensation Act. We'll have an event actually on January 27th in the evening on Downwinders Day of Remembrance that will specifically help folks who haven't applied for that before and who have qualifying health conditions connect to the resources that they need to do that. And I think that's going to be a really interesting one as we go forward, because Utah has real potential to be on the front lines of radioactive exposures once again. We know very well that there is no safe level of radiation exposure. And we also know that women and children are disproportionately affected. And at the same time, we are seeing radiation protection limits rolled back at the federal level, even as we see billions upon billions of dollars going into nuclear energy. I'll take a brief sidebar on nuclear energy right now and just tell you why HEAL in particular is concerned about this. Not only is it the fact that throughout the entire nuclear fuel chain here in Utah, we are going to be impacted, and Indigenous nations are going to be impacted, rural communities are going to be disproportionately impacted. But we also know that nuclear energy, while some folks on both sides of the aisle are very excited about it, is slow, costly, and will really, really affect ratepayers as well as taxpayers who are paying for the federal subsidies going into this. We think there are better sources of energy, such as geothermal, such as solar and wind, plus battery storage. And we hope that our lawmakers can, when they talk about doing all of the above or any of the above energy development, will put more focus and investment into those other areas. One final area that I want to mention, because we were able to get some movement finally last time. So about 1 in 3 lung cancers across the US is due to radon exposure. And we were able to bring more focus on this area last year. We're hoping to perhaps bring more legislation around radon protection, because many, many people in Utah do have elevated levels of radon in their home residences. And what we need to see is sort of across the board standardized regulations so that people, especially low income folks who perhaps don't have the resources to pay for that radon mitigation, are not getting ripped off or being told by unlicensed radon companies that they need expensive mitigation measures that they cannot pay for. I'll just move on here and just let you know we this is our 2025. Oh, we skipped around, but that was our 2025 bill tracker. We'll have our 2026 bill tracker coming up shortly. You're always welcome to check it out. We also do try to link to other organizations' bill trackers on that focus more on things like democracy, water, and other areas such as that. And we also, here, let's see, get this run, have a lot of different actions that people can take. We'll have weekly training going up at the Capitol. We have a Capitol report that you can subscribe to on our website. And we really encourage you to come up and join us. At the end of the day, it's important to have a voice in your civic democracy, and you know what you need as a community. So your lawmakers need to hear from you. We're going to have 5 main theme days, January 27th, in addition to the RECA event that I mentioned in the evening, which will be taking place not at the Capitol. On January 27th, we're going to have a toxic and radioactive focus day up at the Capitol. February 3rd will be Active and Public Transit Day. February 10th, we'll have Just Energy Transition Day. February 24th will be focused on clean air. And then, of course, we have the end of the lobbying being the legislative session, and we'll have a legislative wrap up around March 18th. So I'll turn it back over to Kathy here and just thank you for the time.
Thank you,
Happy to
Lexie.
chat more.
Yeah, it feels like we've actually been through these fights before. I wonder, obviously the legislature isn't particularly interested in solar or wind power right now. And they don't care about toxic waste. But what about water? I mean, nuclear energy takes water, which is something that we don't have.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, Kathy. And what we will hear from our legislators right now, actually, water was one of the issues that did produce some pushback from our legislators last session. What we often hear from industry folks, lobbyists, and so on is that, the new technology is totally different. It doesn't take water. We're using molten salt. But that is not, in fact, the case. There's still a substantial amount of water that is going to be needed for any nuclear projects, as well as the fact that if we do host any nuclear energy here in Utah, those spent fuel rods at this point will be stored on site in people's backyards and in communities close to farms, close to rivers, and so on and so forth. I think another really big issue, I think, as you raised, is that data centers do take a lot of water. And we've seen communities already impacted by expanding data centers that have taken up their groundwater. And I know that that is an area that hopefully we can leverage to create a little bit more concern and pushback amongst our legislators.
And we also have a question or statement from Linda Smith. She says Granite has withdrawn the application for a permit they submitted 3 years ago and has submitted a new application for a smaller quarry in Parley's. We fear that they will seek to expand it. UPHE has asked DAQ to expand the time for comments. Do you know much about that?
Yes, so that was what I mentioned earlier. As I mentioned before, that Parley's Canyon proposed gravel pit has repeatedly looked for ways to work around the difficulty of obtaining an air quality permit for a larger operation. So last year there was a piece of legislation that potentially paved the way for making it easier to expand from a very small permit to a large permit without having to go through the entire process. I will say the bill sponsor at the time claimed that it would not facilitate Parley's, but we got to take that one with a grain of salt. And currently, what we've just heard from the Division of Air Quality is that comment period has not been expanded to the full 30 days, but currently it is open, I believe, through January 31st. Linda, you can confirm that for me.
Okay. Thank you very much. One question or comment that we had earlier probably for Eric, it says a good place to sign up voters is in the parking lots of state liquor stores. You might find a different demographic from the people the canvassers are approaching. Is anybody willing to go to state liquor stores to
I
register?
mean, it'd probably be pretty easy to recruit volunteers to go help do that. We'll do that in the dispensary or two while we're at it.
Right. Okay, Lexie, I think you can stop your share there. And I will just thank you. I just want to thank our presenters. They've been incredible. Several of them have mentioned bill trackers. The League of Women Voters does have a new application. It's on our website. If you go to Take Action, not only does it allow you to send messages, letters, whatever to your representatives, you can then go over to bills and it will list all of the bills that we are interested in, that our legislative priorities are attuned to. I don't know. Peggy, can you share screen to show them where that is by any chance? Or should I?
It'll just take me a second. I'll do that.
Okay. This is a really, I mean, it's very beneficial, and I'm so glad that some of you are also linking to ours. We'll do the same. We have a lot of issues, obviously. We've only touched on a few tonight, but you know, this is going to be quite a legislative session. So hang on, here we go. And if you go to our website and then go to Take Action and then Bills, we've already populated some of the bills that are coming up or will come up. You can sort them. You can see what we think about them, whether we approve them, oppose them, or whatever. It's really an excellent tool. And it's open to anyone in the public. So tell your friends about it. This is not strictly a league application. It's something for everyone. So thank you all. Okay, Linda. Linda has one more question. What about legislation or funding for Great Salt Lake? Lexie, I think that goes back to you.
Yeah, so I don't know. We have, I'm still watching to see what will come down the line on um, Great Salt Lake funding. Obviously, we heard a big announcement this year. That was sort of a challenge to put more funding towards Great Salt Lake. I'm not sure what that will look like in the actual budget and what the sources of that will be. Um, we've seen a couple water bills start to drop so far, and I also know that currently the Division of Air Quality is forging forward with an increased monitoring network for dust from Great Salt Lake, which I think is a really important move. They passed legislation a couple years ago and they never put anything in place because they were frankly afraid that they would be out of compliance on PM10 designations. So, Heal Utah doesn't focus as much on water quality, but we absolutely focus on air quality and general impacts from Great Salt Lake. We frequently link to Great Salt Lake trackers as we find them as well. And we'll certainly keep you apprised of any developments that we hear there as part of that coalition.
Thank you. And Eric points us all to the Five Calls app, which I think most of us are familiar with. It gives you an idea of what to say to your representatives when you call them. I don't use it. I just use the telephone. I just call them. And surprisingly, I got an actual person on one of my calls this last week. So stay involved, everyone. Keep your eyes open. There's a lot happening in this legislative session. Join us up at the legislature. We are also up there every day. So are all these groups. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And as I said, onward. Thank you.